if you think about the way forward for India, the context for human capital, all of us sort of can imagine it at various levels, right? We can imagine it at our individual levels, we can imagine it at our company levels, and we can imagine it at the country level. It is finally human capital is at the country. Productivity is embedded in the air. It is embedded in the institutions, it is embedded in the capital markets, it is embedded in the infrastructure, it is embedded in the education system. And that's sort of why I'm so much more optimistic about India's human capital, because we finally made the right choice. The most dangerous lies are the lies we tell ourselves, right? As individuals, as companies, as boards, as policymakers, as countries. And I think for a long time we told ourselves, at least in policy and in politics, that India's problem was jobs. India doesn't have a jobs problem. We have a wages problem. India's unemployment rate of 6%, plus minus 5.5, has been the same since 1947. Does that mean we're less poor? No, but unemployment has a certain definition. So if you think India has a jobs problem, we'll throw money from helicopters, we'll mandate a 3-day work week, we'll take away people's tractors and give them spoons, because it takes more time to dig with a spoon. I mean, with a tractor, they'll be productive. So when you think India has a jobs problem, your vector of policy making is very different. When you think India has a wages problem, it's much more complicated, because then it is about the productivity of geographies, productivity of firms, productivity of individuals. And I would sort of submit that the only way to raise India's sort of productivity trajectory is 5 things: formalization, financialization, urbanization, industrialization, and human capital as narrowly defined. What corporate India is going through is not a passing shower, it is climate change. Many of them don't seem to recognize that. Once you move away to inflation targeting, most corporates in India are used to high inflation, which meant assets appreciate. But in an asset inflation targeting amount, assets actually depreciate. Most corporates in India have been used to borrowing their equity. You can no longer borrow your equity. In fact, you never could, but it was just sort of fraud. Much less diversified. You can't be in 10 different businesses. I can't run one company. I don't know how people run 5 companies. But the notion that you can wake up in the morning and have these diversified conglomerates with capital structures that are independent of each other, with all of them focusing on return on equity, is little. And I think that less debt, sort of that phone banking from Delhi, which got developed after nationalization in 1969. In the Lok Sabha on 29 July 1969, Indira Gandhi made a statement: I'm nationalizing banks because I want credit to be given to farmers, to the self-employed, and to MSMEs. Un tino ko to mila nahi, right? Bhushan Steels has more debt than India's central government allocation to primary education. You have to process what that means. And I think the less debt model, also not borrowing your equity model, the less diversified model has interesting implications. I think that it has interesting implications for governance. Entrepreneurs like us, who are first-generation entrepreneurs and sort of got started with 2-3 rounds of private equity, we have 3 very different roles in our head. My board shareholder role is very different from my board member role, which is very different from my management role. Most entrepreneurs in India have thought those were concurrent, those were guaranteed, and those were sort of forever. I think once you liberate yourself by sort of saying that, my management role is different from my board role, because the board has to think about the next quarter and next quarter century. The shareholder only has to think of one number. The management has to think about performance sort of across multiple variables. These are not concurrent roles. These are very difficult and different roles. And I think the tone from the top to recognize that the board is thinking about the next quarter and quarter century means you will finance your companies very differently. You will run your companies very differently. You will staff your companies very differently. You will structure your companies very differently. And I frankly think that it's absolutely a very unique time in India, right? When I landed in the US in '94, there was a front page article on the Wall Street Journal which said that India is more interesting than important. I hope that journalist is eating the newspaper on which she wrote that, right? Because what's happening in India isn't once in a decade or once in a millennium. It's really once in the lifetime of a country. But we still do have 300 million people who will never read the newspaper that they deliver, or sit in the car that they clean, or send their kids to the school that they help build. But if you see corporate India right now, you hear the people who are screaming are the ones who have debt, are the ones who are diversified, are the ones who borrowed their equity. And obviously there's some genuine pain in the economy. But I think there's a sort of, out of these, there's always change. Is change always wrong? Is change always bad? Or is change just change? And I think there's a newer sort of India where they're much flatter organizations. When I think of many organizations, traditional ones, and even at RBI or CAGs, what sociologists call a steep authority gradient. These are organizations built for a very different market and a very different India with very steep authority gradients in terms of how hierarchical that is. That's not going to work. I think the incumbents versus insurgents are sort of breaking away. So, if from my vantage point, self-awareness is one of the most powerful tools for driving human performance. My educator wife calls it mirrors, windows, and doors. You hold up a mirror, which is honest, because the most dangerous lies are the lies we tell ourselves. Then it becomes a window where you look out and think about the future, and then it's a door on which you take action for. And I think India's sort of abilities were never low, right? It was about an honest mirror that did we have a jobs problem or do we have a wages problem? Does corruption really matter? Does informality really matter? I think we've answered those questions quite strongly over the last few years, and we'll probably change that answer substantially in the next few years.